Okay. Uh, so this class, we're looking at agricultural inputs. So what are agricultural inputs? They are things such as fertilizer, pesticides, farm power and machinery, and economic credit and wage and so on. All of those are agricultural inputs. And of course, this comes from part of the CAPE syllabus. If you remember, we've looked at definition of agriculture and characteristics of agricultural systems and scale of operation. So we're now going to look at inputs, and the inputs given in the syllabus are agrochemicals, labor, machinery and equipment, energy, and financing. So we're going to look at those. Um, so moving on. The other things are for later classes. So first of all, what are agrochemicals? And these include pesticides, inorganic fertilizers, acidifiers, and liming agents. These kind of adjust the pH of the soil. Soil conditioners. These reduce the salinity of the soil. We'll talk about salinity in a much later on. Growth hormones. And agrochemicals tend to be fairly cheap and have rapid results. And they're used heavily in commercial farms, but not in subsistence farms. And they might have adverse effects. The point is that commercial farming is all about profit, how much money you make. And if the farm produce affects those who consume it, oh, too bad. If it harms the environment, they're probably slightly short-sighted, um, and again, too bad. Because the immediate profit is basically what they're looking at. So, uh, what can we say about pesticides? And these can contaminate the soil and the terrestrial ecosystem or water bodies. Um, and they are toxic to many organisms, including birds, fish, and non-target plants. So the pesticide might affect a plant that you don't want it to affect. And pesticides can be harmful to humans, causing cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and birth defects. And basically, what happens when you apply a pesticide? It's applied to a plant, and it can go into a water body by runoff, or it can go into a water body by leaching. Sometimes it can evaporate into the atmosphere, be carried short or long distances, and then fall in precipitation. So, in other words, a pesticide can end up a great distance from where it was applied. So, DDT applied in Africa, in the Sahara Desert, has ended up in the Caribbean because pesticides can be carried large distances. And until the 1960s, pesticides were used more or less indiscriminately, and they were effective in killing pests, and therefore we use them heavily. And chemical pushed the idea. Uh, of course, the chemical companies also were interested in profit, and therefore encourage people to use as much as possible. Although some scientists knew of the dangers of pesticides, and it was publicized when Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, and you can learn about that here basically. The point about Rachel Carson is that when she tried to make the public aware of the use of pesticides, she herself was attacked. So they attacked the messenger rather than the message, in a kind of sexist and unpleasant way. So they tried to discredit her when really they had no business doing that. So, uh, what can pesticides do? You probably don't need to know these names here. Probably, if you can name a couple of pesticides such as DDT and Nalgene or so on, it's probably helpful. And the damage they do, so they can do nerve damage, DNA mutation, hormone disorders, neurotoxicity, uh, liver damage, uh, developmental, reproductive, and neurological damage, cancer, infertility. Uh, learn the damage that pesticides can do to people, because that's also helpful. What about inorganic fertilizers? These are also a form of agrochemical, and because many nutrients present in the soil are removed when crops are harvested, and natural biogeochemical cycles are disrupted because we're removing part of the plant, it is important to replenish these nutrients using fertilizers, and we often use inorganic fertilizers. Inorganic fertilizers contain the nutrient in a more concentrated form, and it's probably easier to transport, and it's probably less unpleasant. Uh, so these fertilizers are rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Remember that we call fertilizers usually NPK fertilizers, because the most important nutrients needed by plants are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And because crops are harvested, these nutrients are removed and need to be added. And nitrogen is obtained from ammonium ions and nitrate ions, which are obtained by the Haber process. Remember, the Haber process produces ammonia, from which we get ammonium ions. And quite a lot of ammonia is used to make nitric acid, from where the nitrate ions will come from. And this process requires a great deal of energy obtained by the burning of fossil fuels. So therefore, inorganic fertilizers are going to contribute to the greenhouse effect because they're made by the burning of fossil fuels. And hence production of inorganic fertilizers contributes to the greenhouse effect. I said that. And additionally, ammonium ions are acidic and contribute to the acidification of a soil. Remember, ammonium ions are NH4+, and they can break down into NH3 and H+. And the H plus makes the soil acidic. So adding inorganic fertilizers can make our soil acidic. And inorganic fertilizers also kill microorganisms in the soil and reducing something called crumb structure. So what is crumb structure? This is illustrated here. This is a well-structured soil, where the soil particles are large and there's lots of air spaces. Uh, this allows the roots to breathe, and it also allows the roots to obtain water. And it can contain a fair amount of water, although it drains fairly quickly. So air, water, and nutrients are stored in the pores. This is a poor structured soil. There are far less air spaces, and therefore the root finds it harder to obtain air, water, and nutrients. So the crumb structure is very important for a soil. And adding inorganic fertilizers reduces the structure, the crumb structure of a soil. And inorganic fertilizers are also very soluble, causing water pollution due to leaching and runoff. You can see this is a runoff where it just runs from along the surface and into a water body, where it can occur through leaching. Uh, it can occur through leaching. And the next one is the phosphorus. And phosphorus has a sedimentary cycle, and therefore it has to be obtained by mining. And there are few supplies of phosphorus worldwide. And therefore it's possible the world could run out of phosphorus. Well, the phosphorus mines are fairly large. They have large supplies of it. But since it's only in one or two countries, and therefore due to international disagreements and so on, it might be possible that many countries might find it hard to obtain phosphorus. So that's an issue of concern. Then hormones in agriculture. Remember, hormones can be used as agrochemicals. And the use of hormones is permitted in some countries, but not in others. And they make animals bigger, e.g. for use of growth hormones. And such hormones can be found in meat obtained from these animals. So in some countries they'll treat their cows and cattle with growth hormones, so the cattle will get very big. But the growth hormone will therefore be found in the meat. And then I mentioned something on the side that also GM cows continue to lactate through pregnancy, and therefore the milk may contain high levels of estrogen and progesterone. So apparently in some countries the cow's milk will contain estrogens and progesterone. It is said, however, that such hormones are digested in the stomach and do not enter the bloodstream. But it's probably something you ought to be aware of. It should go into should be digested in the stomach, but can you risk it? And at the same point here, I mentioned that animals are also treated with antibiotics to reduce the chance of bacterial infection. And this is common where animals are kept close together, where you have these industrial farms where you have a large number of cows all huddled together. The trouble is that since they're all so close together, if one cow gets an bacterial infection, it will spread to all the others. And therefore, we often treat the animals with antibiotics. And that even applies with fish. So therefore, we've got to be careful with that. And this is common where animals are kept close together, but it increases the chances of the development of antibiotic resistance in bacterial pathogens. So you probably know there's many diseases that affect people, like tuberculosis, which these days is easily treated with antibiotics. But maybe in the future, uh, there'll be many strains of tuberculosis resistant to antibiotics. And this will happen because we're using antibiotics far too much. Uh, After that, another input is labor. And um, agriculture workers are usually uneducated. So most farm workers require unskilled manual labor, and therefore there's low remuneration because much of the work does not require training, so it is poorly paid. And therefore these farm workers are of low socio-economic status. And because farm work is often seen as undesirable, people in developed countries often employ workers from less developed countries. We notice that in Jamaica that we have farm workers who go off to places like Canada and find they're not treated terribly well. So payment is often low and the workers are exploited. And also because farm work in these less developed countries is seen as undesirable. So few people want to become farmers. We have a problem in Jamaica that we have very few people who want to go into agriculture. And that's because of the perception of most farmers being these manual labourers, whereas this really isn't the case. Um, this gives an example of some farm workers probably doing something fairly simple, probably highly overworked. I suppose one thing you can notice here is it seems if strawberries go straight into these packages, which will go straight to the supermarket. So if you ever buy strawberries like this in the supermarket, you must be very careful to wash the strawberries carefully before you eat them. But these workers here probably work long hours and get very little pay. So they are severely exploited for the work they do. But I went on to say that agriculture also provides many other areas of employment. You have geneticists, biotechnologists, food scientists, farm managers, environmentalists, buyer and purchasing agents. And some of these positions require highly qualified individuals who are well paid. So there are positions in agriculture where the payment, in fact, is good. Uh, so input also requires farm equipment. Uh, the ones we see here are probably ones which will be found in any subsistence farmers items. Fairly simple. And again, you see a simple plow here. Although plows such as this are fairly good because they don't do too much harm to the environment. Um, then, after that, farm equipment is used in large commercial farms, and it significantly reduces the need for labor, and therefore reduces the need for employment. So these large farms often have uh, expensive equipment and therefore a small labor force. Um, so it's much faster and increases productivity. So productivity can be increased by these large machines. And it says, however, it uses large amounts of fossil fuel and thus contributes to the greenhouse effect. It also harms crumb structure of the soil. Um, Also, if you're dealing with a rural community, it means you'll have more unemployment because these large machines are taking over the work of farm workers. I suppose I should say here that not too long ago in a CAPE exam, there was a question dealing with types of farming, and one type was plantation farming, which I didn't mention in the discussion earlier. And of course, what are the characteristics of plantation farming? Well, of course, you'll have a large scale farming, monoculture. But for a plantation, you probably don't use heavy machinery. You have a large labor force of badly paid or unpaid workers. And therefore, there's a social inequity where you have the people at the top with a lot of money and then a base which is hardly paid at all. But usually commercial farms are large and have really heavy equipment. Things such as this. This is a harvester. And of course, it can do a lot of work fairly quickly, but it's going to produce a lot of um, carbon dioxide and is therefore harmful to the environment. And you see another large tractor and a plow here. This plow can do a lot more work than the thing we saw earlier, where we just had a small person with a plow pulled by a donkey. But so the point here is modern agricultural machinery can do a large amount of work in a short period of time. However, they are expensive to buy and expensive to maintain and use a lot of fuel. So in part they explain why on modern agricultural energy input exceeds energy output. And they also cause soil compaction and therefore crumb structure is also harmed. So soil compaction is defined as a method of mechanically increasing the density of a soil. In construction, this is a significant part of the building process. If performed improperly, the settlement of the soil could occur and result unnecessarily. Okay, the main point is in the farms. You want the soil to be loose. It's probably bad for building, but a loose soil is good for farming. So soil compaction decreases the ability of the soil to absorb water. Hence, crops get less water. Erosion is more likely to occur because the soil can't go through Water can't go through the soil, so it'll just run off and carry soil with it. And there's less root penetration and lower nutrient uptake. Uh, it'll also make flooding more likely to occur. Again, because the water can't go move down the soil, so it stays on top. And the final input into agriculture is finances. And one problem here is interest rates are high in Caribbean countries, which make borrowing money difficult. That should have said. And farmers tend to require high capital input to begin with. So many farms depend on borrowing money from friends or family. Um, so that basically